Good afternoon, and thank you again for joining us for our February 2019 legislative briefing. I want to turn the legislative briefing over to Levana Layendecker.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I hope everyone is staying warm and dry today. I know it's snowing across the state. And just to introduce myself for those of you who don't know me, my name is Levana Layendecker. I'm the Deputy Director for the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. And let me quickly review over the agenda for today. So first I'm going to give a brief update on what's going on the federal level. Then we're going to move into a longer briefing on the state housing tax credit, which is one of our priority legislative campaigns for this session. I will be giving a brief overview on where the bill currently stands. And then we have Peter Kaplan, who is the Policy Chair for the Housing Alliance Board, to give a briefing on the actual content of the legislation. We're going to pause there for questions that people have about the content or the legislative process. And then we'll have some updates from Phyllis Chamberlain, the Executive Director of the Housing Alliance, on some other state issues. And then we'll leave the remaining time that we have for any additional questions. So again, to start off the top, I wanted to give a very brief federal update. I'm sure many of you have been following the news, and so it comes as no surprise to you that the government is not shut down, and we do have a federal budget. Most of the attention, as we know, was paid to the immigration and security at the border, but there were also lots of other parts of the budget, which included many programs that we care about. All of those programs were level funded from the previous fiscal year. However, many of the programs that help increase affordable housing and provide services to low-income populations are capped at previous funding levels based on legislation that was passed having to do with the sequester and things that happened in previous administration. So I wanted to make everyone aware of two legislative action alerts that came out from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition that the Housing Alliance is supporting, and I hope that all of you will support as well. First, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition is urging everyone to lift spending caps and fund affordable housing and transportation programs at the highest level possible. They have a letter that they're asking organizations to sign on to lift the Austere Budget Control Act federal spending cap and to ensure affordable housing, community development, and transportation programs receive the highest allocation of discretionary funds possible for fiscal year 20. So we are actually going to send that sign-on letter out after this call as part of the follow-up material so you can review it, and we hope that you'll sign on to that. Secondly, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition is also asking everyone to sign on to a letter to all the senators and representatives asking them to increase funding for the National Housing Trust Fund. We know that just recently in Pennsylvania, we received our first National Housing Trust Fund dollars in the previous fiscal year, and some of those projects are already getting started. So that's something that we here in the state could really benefit from. It will help to create more funding for affordable housing, rental, and to increase home ownership. So I just wanted to make everyone aware of that. We will also send that letter out immediately after the call. So with that, we will get started on our briefing on the state housing tax credit. So first of all, I just wanted to let everyone know that the state housing tax credit, the same bill that was introduced in the last session, is currently gathering co-sponsors in the Senate. We're expecting it to be reintroduced in the spring. We don't have an exact date yet, but we do know that the bill number will be Senate Bill 30. And then we'll be activating people around the state housing tax credit on Home Matters Day, which is June 4th. So I just wanted to go ahead and give everyone the heads up. I think this is maybe the first time that we are revealing the date, so mark your calendars, and we hope that we will see all of you there. Now, the state housing tax credit helps to fund affordable rental housing, and we wanted to go over some of the details of how it will work. And so I'm going to turn it over to Peter Kaplan, who's the policy chair, to talk about that, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Sounds great. Levana, thank you very much. My name is Peter Kaplan, and I am chair of the Policy Committee of the Housing Alliance Board of Directors. I'm going to present a very brief summary of the proposed state low-income housing tax credit legislation. I'm going to do that presentation in the form of answers to a few basic questions about the proposed state housing credit. And after this short presentation, we'll have a brief question and answer period. Please keep in mind that we will be emailing all of you a multi-page frequently asked questions, or FAQ, after the call. Next slide, please. The purpose of the state housing tax credit is to allow corporate and individual investors to receive state tax credits, which are a dollar-for-dollar reduction in their state income tax obligation in return for making investments in affordable rental housing. The dollars raised from these investments in the credit will provide funds for creating and preserving affordable rental housing for Pennsylvanians with low incomes. The state tax credit will be closely modeled after the existing and very successful federal housing tax credit program. Next slide, please. The Housing Alliance is supporting the enactment of a state housing credit to provide an additional source of funds that can be used to fill the funding gaps of affordable housing developments and enable them to go forward. The need for additional funding is especially urgent because the reduction in the federal corporate tax rate done through the 2017 tax bill has made the federal housing credit less valuable to corporate investors, and these investors are therefore paying lower prices for the federal credits. The proposed state tax credit legislation will provide $10 million in housing credits over 5 years. Next slide, please. Like the existing federal housing credit, the state housing credit will be used to serve households of up to 80% of the area median income. However, the state tax credit will also require that 10% of the funds raised by the state credit must be used for households at or below 30% of the area median income. This is not a project-by-project requirement, but it does require that overall the funds be allocated 10% to households at that income level. Next slide, please. Any for-profit or nonprofit sponsor who is eligible for the federal housing credit will also be eligible to apply for the state housing credit. The state housing credit will not require a separate application, as both credits will be administered by the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, or PHFA, as the federal credit is now. The legislation has been drafted to parallel the federal housing tax credit closely to minimize any complications for investors. However, it's going to have some key features that we hope will make it attractive to smaller investors and thereby bring new capital sources for the development of affordable housing in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We're now happy to take a few minutes for questions. Again, keep in mind that we will be sending all of you an informative FAQ at the end of the call. And Levana, I'll turn the meeting back over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter. I know that was a brief overview, but I think those are the questions that we get most often, so we wanted to start there. But I think that people probably have other questions about how this will work or how it will move forward. So with that, Colleen, I will let you give people instructions on how to ask questions, and we'll see what questions folks have.
Sure. So if you'd like to ask a question via the phone, please feel free to unmute your line by pressing *7. That's *7 to unmute your individual line. Or you can type in the chat box feature in the bottom left-hand corner your question, and we will read the question aloud and answer it as well. Mm-hmm.
Hi, this is Cindy Picone with A.M. Rodriguez Associates.
Hi,
I have a question.
Hi, Cindy.
Sure.
Hi, Peter. I was just curious. You mentioned that the intent is to try to incentivize smaller scale investors. I was wondering whether a state housing tax credit paired with the federal tax credit would have any impact on other investors who might otherwise no longer find it attractive because they don't have a state housing or state tax need. How does that work? Or maybe it's not a problem.
Just if I could, Levana and Colleen, just one of the things that the Housing Alliance did was we convened in the run-up to introducing the bill last year was that we convened a group of investors to talk about this because it was a concern, and they were nonetheless very open to the idea of having a state housing tax credit. There are a lot of times there are people who there are investors who are investing because they have a CRA need, a Community Reinvestment Act need in a particular place, which is often correlated with a state tax obligation. At the same time, because we're going to be able to bifurcate the credit and allow people to have separate state tax credit investors, if they don't want to invest in that credit, they don't have to, and other investors can be found to take that credit. And we also think that because the state tax credit will have a shorter time period, a 5-year period, it may be more attractive to smaller investors that can be attracted into the transactions. And there's also the idea of doing a certificate election, which would mean that a state investor who's not part of it doesn't have to be part of the partnership. So it's not another investor that has to be necessarily consulted if the larger non-state investor wants to go ahead and do what they need to do to protect their interests.
Thank you.
Great. So we had a question from Caroline Dunleavy about who is currently sponsoring the legislation. So I just wanted to address that. I'm sure other folks in the group want to know as well. So the prime sponsor is Senator Killian from Chester County. And then we have 11 other co-sponsors. So I'll just super quickly read them off, and just so you can listen for your senator. We have Senator Bogle, Senator Hughes, Senator Haywood, Senator Argyle, Senator Blake, Senator Fontana, Senator Leach, Senator Santasiero, Senator Tartaglione, Senator Udacek, and Senator Costa. That's our current list of co-sponsors, and we're working right now to gather more co-sponsors, and that's one thing that we have actively been asking everyone to do. So if you've been watching our newsletter, you'll see that we've had an action alert asking you to call your own senator and ask them to co-sponsor this legislation. That'll come out in the newsletter again later today, and we'll also share it in the follow-up materials from this call. So I have another question in the chat from Sonia. And Sonia is asking if the Housing Alliance has a position on SB 31, which creates funding into FAIR by lifting the cap. So Sonia, that actually is the next topic of discussion, which Phyllis is going to go into more detail on. But I'll just say, yes, we absolutely support that. So that's another piece of legislation that we've been prioritizing. We're just focusing on the state housing tax credit today. So we'll come back to that. Does anyone else have questions? People, you can press *7 to unmute yourself, or you can type something into the chat. Okay, so Tim Whelan made a comment, so we will share this comment with DHFA, but I'll share it with you as well. He just mentions that when working on the application process and rules for the tax credit, please find a way to keep the application process more modest than the current federal low-income housing tax credit process. Smaller investors might be scared away by an expansive application process. Thank you for sharing that, Tim. We can see what we can do to work with PHFA on that. Peter, I don't know if you wanted to add anything there about your experiences with the application processes.
Well, I think there's no question that the application process can be fairly daunting. That's really up to the sponsor, and the investor actually will, other than providing a letter, generally is not going to be that involved in the application process per se. And if they want it to be simple, using the certificated election is one way to keep the process itself very simple and not needing to get involved in the partnership agreement details, et cetera, just being able to take the credit. So I think there are ways that will make the process simpler, but the application process itself generally does not involve the investor other than providing a short letter indicating that the investor is willing to pay X amount for the credits and the amount of their investment.
So I just wanted to announce that Senator Moose is now a co-sponsor of the State Housing Tax Credit, or SB 30, as well. So that is a new announcement. So we're very happy to have her, and thank you. All right, so I'll just, more chance if anyone has any questions or comments. You can press *7 to unmute yourself or add something to the chat. All right, so we'll go ahead and move on because I know that we have some other topics that we want to cover. So Phyllis, I will turn it over to you to talk about some other issues.
Great. Before I start talking, Levana, I just want to have you confirm that you can hear me.
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. So again, this is Phyllis Chamberlain. I'm the Executive Director for the Housing Alliance. And I wanted to provide an update on 2 additional state issues. One is to increase funding for FAIR, or the State Housing Trust Fund, and the second is around prevailing wage. Starting with FAIR, in addition to the State Housing Tax Credit that we just discussed, our top policy priority, in addition to that, is to increase funding for the FAIR program. Many of you, I'm sure, have either applied and successfully applied for FAIR dollars. FAIR is a very flexible program administered by PHFA that provides funding for a pretty broad list of eligible housing activities. So as an example, in some communities it's been used to fill the gap for tax credit projects. In others it's been for rehab. In other communities it's been used for services for the homeless population, and it's also been used for first-time homebuyer counseling. That just gives you a sense of how flexible those dollars are. FAIR has 3 funding sources, and the largest funding source is a portion of the state realty transfer tax. There was legislation that the Housing Alliance worked very hard with all of you to get passed back in 2015, and that bill allocated a portion of the realty transfer tax to FAIR, but it capped the amount at $25 million. Because the real estate market has been so strong, the RTT revenue has been increasing. And this year, for the first time, we hit the cap, where if there were no cap, PHFA would have had an additional $9.1 million to allocate to projects all across the state. So our goal is to increase the amount of funding that FAIR receives from that specific funding source, the RTT. We are currently talking with a number of legislators about their interest in being the prime sponsor. So stay tuned as we hope to have a co-sponsorship memo and legislation pretty shortly, and certainly we'll let you know as soon as we have a commitment to be the prime sponsor. Separately, related to FAIR, there has been a proposal from the governor's office to reallocate the funding for the General Assistance Program, which is cash assistance, to FAIR. People may have seen this. There's been quite a few articles in the media about it. And from what we understand, there is a bill in the House that would once again eliminate cash assistance. It was eliminated several years ago, but the Supreme Court actually required the state to reinstate it. And there's a bill to eliminate it once again. Our limited understanding is that the governor wanted to preempt that and made a proposal to take that money and put it into FAIR. We don't have a lot of information about how that would work, but we are not advocating to increase affordable housing resources at the expense of another program that serves very vulnerable households. So our work on FAIR to increase resources is completely separate from that proposal. And if you have concerns about that proposal, I would certainly encourage you to weigh in. What we understand about general assistance is that it's available to the very poorest of the poor and provides them with a very small amount of funding to help them meet some very basic needs. So it's not exactly used for the same purpose as FAIR. I'm going to now move on to prevailing wage, and then once I talk a bit about prevailing wage, we'll open it up for additional questions. There is a bill that Senator Gordner will be introducing. He's currently circulating a co-sponsorship memo, and the legislation will reestablish the exemption that was previously in place for projects that have home funding. The exemption would be to state prevailing wage rates. So back in I think the summer of 2016, there was a memo that was released by DCED informing us that labor and industry had changed the way that they interpret the applicability of state prevailing wage law. What was in place prior to that memo is that any projects that had CDBG and home money, but no state funding, state prevailing wage law was not relevant. But what the state now is saying is that they're changing the way they interpret that. And even if your project has CDBG and home money and is exempt from the federal Davis-Bacon wage rates, your project is now no longer exempt from state prevailing wage. And particularly in our small towns and rural communities, this has created quite a challenge in that very limited federal resources are no longer producing the same amount of work or the same amount of units, and or communities are deciding that they can't make the projects work because the labor costs have gone up very substantially. If this is a problem for you, you know it very well. We have heard about this challenge at the Housing Alliance quite often, and I would encourage you to do two things. One is to reach out to your senators to ask them to co-sponsor Senator Gordner's legislation, and we'll send a little bit more information after the call. But I'd also encourage you to reach out to us to give us your concrete examples of how this change in interpretation is impacting you and your ability to adequately serve your community with additional affordable housing. I also want to be clear that we are not seeking to change state prevailing wage law in total. We know, obviously, that an adequate wage is essential to being able to afford housing. What we're simply trying to do is to create an exception for small projects, particularly in small towns and rural communities, that are no longer able to make these projects work. I will stop and see if anybody has any questions.
So again, press *7 to unmute yourself, or you can type something into the chat box. We do have a question, Phyllis. I don't know if you know this off the top of your head. Do you know who the current co-sponsors of Senator Gordner's bill are?
I do not, but as soon as we receive that updated list, we will also send it out in the follow-up materials to this call.
Okay, I can follow up with that specifically, Sonia, as well. Any other questions, or anyone have any comments about either?
Yeah, hello, Phyllis.
Yes, hello, go ahead.
Hi, Phyllis, this is Tim Whalen. I'll work with our community development folks. We've been finding ourselves tied in knots on small projects by prevailing wage. And so I think we'll have some good examples around some modest little things like building a playground, as a community project, and how prevailing wage has caused local contractors to stay away from bidding on projects because of the work associated around time sheets and the like. So I think we'll have some good examples for you on those small projects.
Perfect, Tim. And when I say perfect, obviously that's terrible. I mean perfect for our advocacy. But thank you. The more examples, the more real examples that we have to make this understandable and real to legislators, the better. So that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, and I am a union member, and so I fully support the notion that people need family-sustaining jobs, and that some of the core values in prevailing wage are to support our workers. But we also see that there are times when the state prevailing wage really doesn't match what local wage rates are, or it interferes with a lot of these smaller projects. So we share your concern about how do you balance this effort of trying to create an exemption for small projects without starting to grit the impacting things that would harm working families.
Right, exactly. Well said. Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to remind people one more time, you can press *7 to unmute yourself if you have a question, and we can take questions about the state housing tax credit, about fares, about general assistance, or about prevailing wage. Just feel free to hop in. All right. Well, I hope this was informative for everyone. You're going to get a nice packet of follow-up materials from us on the national issues, the state housing tax credit, and an action alert about calling your senators to co-sponsor. We'll be keeping everyone updated on all of these issues. And don't forget to mark your calendars. June 4th is going to be Home Matters Day this year, so we'll see you all in Harrisburg then. And thanks again for joining us today. And thank you, Peter and Phyllis, for your update.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone.